one was last week. This is going to be the first student-led Monday session. So this week's theme is all about museums, artefacts and dark heritage. So we initially have no real fixed format for how this is going to go, and it might change as the weeks go on depending on who the speakers are and what they'll be talking about. So for this week we're going to have Dr. Laura McAtackney going first, and then we're going to have Brenda Malone, and then we're going to have an overall discussion because there's a lot of intersecting themes between both of the presentations. So I'd like to begin by introducing Dr. Laura McAtackney. She is an associate professor in the Department of Archaeology and Heritage Studies at Aarhus University, Denmark, which she joined in 2015. She's also a docent in contemporary historical archaeology at the University of Oulu in Finland since 2019. Her research includes long-standing interests in contemporary archaeological and critical heritage-based approaches to social justice issues that are focused on exploring material remains. This includes long-term studies on political imprisonment, such as Longkesh Maze Prison and Kilmainham Jail, post-conflict Northern Ireland, especially segregation walls, gender perspectives on the past, and the experiences and memory of the colonial Caribbean with a focus on the islands of Montserrat and St. Croix. She's currently the PI for an independent research fund, Denmark Project 2 collaboration, enduring materialities of colonialism, temporality, spatiality, and memory. A co-I on Archaeobalt, which is an EU Interreg South Baltic project on promoting blue and green tourism through archaeological tourism in the South Baltic region, and is part of the Open Heart City Collective, working with Magdalene Laundries in Ireland. And there's a wonderful podcast with Laura where she goes in depth about her experiences. And I've stolen the quote from my introduction from the website. Unlike most other archaeologists, it's not happening today. She does not dig in the past, but in the present. So with that being said, I'm sure we're all eagerly awaiting her presentation. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Laura McAtackney.
I apologise for all the big words in that introduction. That must have been a mean struggle on a Monday afternoon. So, lots of stuff I could talk about, but I've tried to focus this looking at kind of the potentials of the materials at this site, Sean McDermott St, Magdalene Laundry. There's lots of other angles I could take, because I work with Brenda and with other colleagues at the Donnybrook Magdalene Laundry, which is a completely different story, but in some ways they come together, and they will come together at this site. So they should thread through quite nicely, and they probably will come through in both presentations. So I'm going to have like 2 or 3 just kind of text-heavy slides, just so you have something, because otherwise it's going to be a lot of images that you're going to be able to look at afterwards. And just looking at the issues of heritage, I don't know how much you really engage with issues of heritage, of this idea of what we retain from the past and what we is meaningful in the present and we're supposed to retain from the future, but particularly in critical heritage studies is this focus on moving from past, present, future continuum. So everything we're kind of think is important now often ties to something we thought was important in the past, and we're really future making as well. So we're deciding what we think future generations are going to find important. Lots of discussions and arguments about how we can do that or not. But really the important thing to take is that heritage isn't just the stuff, it's about processes. And it's about the decisions we make, about what we think is important and how we make it important. And these decisions are always political. And that could be like small p political or large p political, particularly when we're looking at issues around national heritage and what we think is important for our nation and what our identity is as a nation. So Lipsinski, which I've put a nice little hard surname in for myself now, argues, and he's working in the South African context, looking at transitional justice and heritage, and argued that significance lies in heritage and the fact that it can be used to write and rewrite history, and particularly what we decide to make part of our national collections, what we decide as national heritage, says something about what we say is important about us as a nation at that point in time. So it means we need to reconsider we can reconsider what we think is heritage and how it reflects the identity of the nation on an ongoing basis. But in the context of this work in South Africa, and I would argue this work now we're doing with Magdalene Laundries, it's especially in response to major societal changes and traumas. So whenever something happens in society to make us rethink what it is we are, then this is a point when we can really rethink what our heritage is, and we can start to add new areas and maybe think about the things that are not so important anymore. And whenever we're at the stage now when all the Magdalene laundries are shut, but we have a small number that still haven't transitioned into other things, it's a really important time to have that kind of conversation and think about what we do with these sites. So transforming a site that retains part of a Magdalene laundry has lots of practical issues. What we decide to retain and curate as collections, what buildings you retain, who owns them, what they are combined with, how they are made accessible or not to the public, and how we present and interpret them. And these all are important and all have material traces and all tie in with questions of what we do as architects and archaeologists and heritage professionals and museums. So materials, I would argue, are integral to this process. As an archaeologist, I will always say materials are integral to any process. But really, not just what we retain, but why we retain it and how we retain it. And the archaeologist Laurent Olivier, who's a French archaeologist, has written this really great book called The Dark Abyss of Time, which is just such a kind of French name for a book on archaeology. And he argues that the survival of material memory is really important, so that material has memory of what happened to it in the past, and even if we don't engage with it now, the fact that material remains means it has the potential to mean something in the future, and we can work with it then. So it allows us to retrieve forgotten histories now, but also potentially at unknown points in the future. So we need to be careful of the materials we decide to discard and why we decide to discard them. So selections need to involve an understanding of the interplay of various scales, levels and forms, and this goes from landscapes to buildings to artefacts to text to people. You know, what they tell us now, how they inform each other, and what is their potential in the future. And there's always the interplay between those. As architects and as a buildings archaeologist, you can't just focus on the structures, you have to think about how it involves things that are smaller, things that are bigger, and also people, and also what's written about it, because these inform what we can say about these places. So what I think is important for this case is the role of inherited architecture, particularly what's left of the Magdalene laundries, and especially this one, the Sean McDermott St. Following Daniel Miller, who's a material culture specialist anthropologist, he's argued that houses, the elephants of stuff, attract the attention of power. And so we focus on them because they're associated with the intentions of the powerful, but we have to think about how do we locate hidden and forgotten experiences within these structures. And secondly, the ability of artefacts to connect and interact with architecture in order to reveal agency and individual experience. And the archaeologist Victor Buckley has written about this in terms of socialist architecture, that the architecture tells you what was the intentions of the creator, the objects tell you how people live within it. And so that structure and agency you have to take together if you want to get more nuanced stories of what goes on in these places. And so to tie into work I've previously done, I've mainly worked on political prisons in Ireland. I've done some work in South Africa and Australia as well. But long-term studies on Long-Keshmier's prison, which is just outside Lisburn, which is just outside Belfast in Northern Ireland, for anyone who doesn't know where that is. And Kilmainham Jail in Dublin, which I hope most of you know where it is and have been to. What I found from doing work in these places is that decisions made at different points in time have really skewed what we can do with those buildings and how we can understand them. When I started studying Long-Keshmier's prison, I did my PhD on it as a study of a building, a contemporary study, and it was only 3 years after the building had closed as a functional prison. In that time, it has went from a huge landscape with over 300 buildings to a very contained landscape with only about 10 buildings left because the rest have been knocked down. And there was at different points, different ideas about what could happen to this site. It was given a lot of money from the EU to be turned into a kind of, international centre of peace and reconciliation, which didn't tie in that well with them having the DUP and Sinn Féin as the two main parties in the north. And so it got scrapped, and a lot of the site was kind of silently, knocked down and demolished behind the scenes. And really a lot of that is to do with, Republican over-identifications with the hunger strikes and the materialisations of that in the site, which is the prison hospital, which most of the hunger strikers died within. And the kind of unionist fear of that site being too powerful to really include other narratives in. But whenever you only keep around 10 buildings and one of them is a prison hospital, that really dilutes what you can do to add different stories to the site. So I've been kind of interested in how those identifications have changed and how much the materials that remain really skew what we can do as time moves on. Similar but different things happening in Kilmainham Jail. A lot more of it survives, but for different reasons. And what I was interested in was the survival of graffiti from the kind of revolutionary period. So I did a study of all the graffiti inside the prison. And what I found is because the focus of the early heritage initiatives in the site, which were in the early 1960s, were on the east wing of the prison, which is the kind of spectacular wing with the big glass roof and the kind of traditional Victorian panopticon. What it did, because it was the focus of the heritage initiatives of the 60s, what they wanted to do was create a pristine site that kind of tied back into 1916 and the Easter Rising. So they chipped off all the graffiti on the walls of all the cells. I think there was only 6 that were left which didn't have the walls chipped off. But because the West Wing wasn't as spectacular, wasn't as interesting, they weren't sure they were going to keep it. They didn't take any of the graffiti away. So whenever I went into that site in 2012, I could go and retrieve all the graffiti from one part of the site, and then there was very little I could retrieve from the other, because decisions had been made 70 years ago to make the site look attractive and to make it look pristine. So it wasn't, these places aren't here for us as archaeologists or architects to pick through. Things happen for different reasons, and so if we have part of that process, then we have to think that what we might intentionally or unintentionally do whenever we make material changes to sites. And as I said, just these 2 prisons have made me think about that over time. So to move on to what the main focus is, which is the Sean McDermott St site. So as you can see, I'm going to try and recreate this thing. I'll get a bit closer. So the red marks around it are kind of indicating what the boundaries of it is. And what's kind of interesting is this large section in the middle here, which is kind of effectively what has been knocked down already in between. The bits of the site that are left that tie into the Magdalene Laundry are the convent buildings on the front of the road, and then the church, which you can just see behind it. See if I can put that. Yeah, church, convent buildings, and then this is kind of the women's dormitory, the women who worked in the laundry. Most of the laundry site would have been in here, and most of it's been knocked down, so we don't have the laundry left, which is obviously an integral part of Magdalene Laundry. But as Brenda will discuss more later, the interesting thing about the work we've done in Donnybrook is that it only has the laundry left, and it doesn't have all the other bits. So effectively, we have 2 sites in 2 different parts of Dublin, which coming together actually create an entire site. But we don't have either of them pristine, and not that you'll ever have them pristine on either site. So there's kind of challenges around how you deal with a site like this, which has a lot of stuff still there, but it has a lot of stuff missing. So what are the most important things? Have you all been to the site, Jen? Yes. Yeah. So I'm sure you've all seen this church, which is very spectacular, very pretty, if I may say, in a very vernacular way. It's very attractive, a kind of 19th century Italian, pretty church. Obviously kept in quite nice condition against the rest of the buildings that you've been around. And one of the issues with something like this is it's spectacular architecture, it's monumental architecture, it's very attractively and ornately ordained. And what that can do is can distract from what is the point of this project, which is to think about the women who were kept in this site rather than to celebrate the lovely architecture that remains there. And so it's having a part like this always made me a bit wary, because I've seen heritage sites that have changed over time, particularly when we're talking this issue of dark heritage. Like dark heritage is this idea that we keep certain sites because they're really difficult and because they're really dark and dangerous, and they connect to really difficult parts of the past. But the issue with that is that things change over time, so things can be really dark, but if we don't retain that darkness, they can become something else. And when you have kind of attractive, pretty buildings like this, then they can kind of distort what the point of keeping these sites are, because they're just the kind of attractive churches. Unless you can do something to kind of play with that a little bit and try to use it as a critique of the wealth of the church against the women who were kept there. I think there has to be creative and interesting ways that we work with kind of places like this that superficially can just appear to be nice, attractive, architecturally interesting buildings. There's also a lot of stuff left on the walls and underneath the walls. So again, I don't know how much you've seen around the convent building, but there's a lot of the wallpaper falling off, and they have these kind of slightly creepy looking religious phrases that are, hidden beneath that. And from the number of, I haven't been in the building for a number of months, but I'm sure there's even more of this wallpaper starting to fall off. There's even more of these old walls starting to appear. So, thinking about what we do with a site like this is like, what kind of layers do we want to get to? Like, how much do we want to play with these issues of ruin? How much do we want to show layers of how this site existed over time, but not to discard things like this. It's fairly superficial, but it gives an indication of what these sites would have looked like, back in time before they started being covered over with more generic kind of wallpapers and paintings. And of course, again, up on one of the top floors is like deeply, deeply creepy religious artifacts. So this kind of cross crucifix was on the top floor whenever I was last in, and it's huge, it's taller than I am. Give all of us a bit of a fright walking around the corner. We weren't expecting deep red walls and a crucifix sitting in the corner. But in a way also they're problematic because, it's such an evocative space, like these deep red walls, these huge religious statues everywhere, can add these layers of stories that kind of make us think that this is the important narratives connected to these sites. And I'm really wary of how complete the convent is and the churches against these other places that are less complete, and how that can focus our narratives to those, when actually we need to think of other ways of trying to engage with these spaces and try to think about how to use them. This is a downstairs room in the convent, which is the bit which is just attached to the church. There's tons of objects still left there. Like, from what I know, the nuns, whenever they were selling the site, started trying to get rid of as much of the materials from the site as possible. But there's still a lot of kind of not very attractive furniture and bits and pieces lying about. And it's worthwhile thinking about what types of things are there. As I've said, the architecture tells us a certain story, the artifacts within that tell us other stories. So how was this site left? This is after it closed in 1996. What kind of things are in there, what can they tell us about how people lived in that site? And it's worthwhile at some stage us thinking about what kind of objects are there. There's a lot more stuff in the industrial complex that Brenda will go into, but there's some things that we need to consider with what's on the site now and what it can potentially tell us that might be different from what the buildings can. And lastly, this is in the attic of the convent, and I think this is kind of one of the most poignant places. There's a lot of weird random stuff up there as well. But what I was focused on is these cases in the back of the attic. So these are people, who came to this site who never left. One of your cases still there. It's people who came in, their things were taken out, their cases were put in the attic, and that was it. They never went away again. And there's something quite poignant about how you can use something like that, something quite nondescript and ordinary, but also tells us quite strong stories about what it was to go into these places. So very quickly, I'll just go a couple of minutes. So what I'm really focused on, a part of these buildings, is the women's dormitories, which, as you can see, are left in a pretty bad state of repair, which I don't think is accidental. They're boarded up at the bottom, a lot of windows broken, trees going through it. This is really the only part of this complex that is associated with the women who were in that site. And this is their living quarters. There's still bits in there. We still know there was names on doors and things like that. Don't really know what's inside because apparently it's unsafe. So I was able to kind of look down a corridor. Bits of the roof were falling in. But, I think it's really one of the most important buildings on the site to think about, trying to save and trying to do something with, because it's the only part of the site that is not completely about the religious order and their areas. This is the areas connected to the women, and I think that's important, even if it's not the most aesthetically pleasing, even if it's a bit of a shell, what can we potentially do with that? And lastly, also this idea of absences. So again, looking at Buckley and Lucas have talked about how we present absence whenever we're doing archaeologies in the present. Sometimes things disappear for reasons because people don't want them to be there because they're uncomfortable. At the back of the site, there is a lot of evidence of old laundry structures that were there whenever the buildings were knocked down. So, we have a lot of little kind of footprints like this. How do we incorporate those into the stories of this site? These kind of things that are still present, even if they've been taken out. What kind of footprints are there, and how can we reconstruct them to tell us what was actually at that site in that particular area. And there's another bit, which I think is probably a bathroom. Looks a little like toilet stalls. But still, you can get a certain amount of... I always find those bits quite evocative, you know, where there's just a footprint of what was there before without it actually being structurally there. And then I'm going to leave for Brenda to talk more about Donnybrook, but I just wanted to put a picture up. This is the site that, you know, was recently sold, was going through the process of being sold, and it's going to be refurbished for, you know, kind of flats and things like that. But this is only the industrial part of the site that was left at Donnybrook. The convent beside it retained all the women's dormitories and the commons area in the church. So this is a completely different type of site. The same, it's a Magdalene Laundry, but we've got completely opposite remains. Okay, so I will finish with this. Key issues, I would say, is the interplay of absence and presence. Alongside the stuff, what is missing? How can we re-presence those aspects deliberately hidden? How do we work with survivors and their living memory? And the absence of text, because, you know, we don't have a lot of documentation about the site because the nuns still have it, or they don't have it anymore. And, you know, what can we do in this with these kind of processes at this point in time? You know, how do we ensure these places allow for living and active commemoration of the past, so they become kind of heritage sites, kind of memorials, but also commemorative places that have active memory, not just a kind of dead memorial? And how do they live side by side with an active and evolving future? So how do you balance that at a site like this? And then maintaining the ethos of one of my colleagues, Jim Dixon, who's also a building archaeologist. He says what the difference between contemporary archaeology and other archaeologies is that we have a different responsibility to the world we study, and the world we study is our own. And then there's bibliography, which I'll obviously use will keep, and you can look up any of the works that I read. Thank you.
So just to give a little introduction as well to our next speaker is Brenda Malone. And she's the curator of military history, arms and armour, flags and banner, transport and contemporary Ireland collections at the National Museum of Ireland. She has a specific interest in the idea of nation and national identity in museums. She has co-curated major military and history exhibitions such as Soldiers and Chiefs and Proclaiming a Republic, amongst others. She has communicated widely about the historical collections and their meaning at both an individual and national level. One of her most recent curatorial works includes the Irish Wars, 1919 to 1923, an exhibition that opened last Wednesday in the National Museum of Ireland. She has established a contemporary Ireland collection at the NMI, working to collect the material culture of the issues at the heart of our modern society, such as difficult histories within the Irish state, women's history, institutional abuse, and LGBTQ+ civil rights. She writes and manages the blog The Cricket Bat That Died for Ireland, which explores and interprets artifacts in the historical and military collections at the NMI. And she has previously curated the museum's Irish folklore collections, which is vernacular furniture and architecture. And I would definitely recommend going to that blog. I'm not sure, is it still active?
Not as active as it should be. Busy.
Well, let's welcome Brenda Malone.
I have a confession to make. I had an edited version of this on a flash drive and I forgot to bring it, and so we're stuck with the 40-slide version. So we're just going to stream right through it, and we can go back and talk about anything else that I pass by if it takes your fancy. Okay, so I suppose it was something like early 2018 that I got a phone call from Laura, who had heard my work in collecting repeal, and she figured that I was interested in contemporary stuff, so she rang me up and said, "Do you want a laundry? A Magdalene Laundry?" And I said, "Yeah, okay." And I decided I'd figure out where to put it later, that salvaging became the most important thing, because we live in a very We live in a culture now that everything that we create is very disposable and very, very quickly. So it seems now that you really have to move quickly on gathering material culture. Fortunately, the pieces that we're about to look at here in Donnybrook have been there since, I think some of them date back to the 1930s. But they are deteriorating at an alarming rate where they are right now. And the only thing that has stalled us from actually going in with a big truck and taking them out is the fact that they're covered in asbestos. So there's always something that is going to delay you from moving on with the project. So this project has been, we're coming up in 2 years, I think.
Yeah.
And we still don't have the laundry contents out, but we're hoping to maybe in the next 2 months. So anyway, we'll move on. So Laura introduced the site of Donnybrook, so she was saying that between the two sites we basically have a hole, which is very important to tell the story. So the Donnybrook element is the industrial element of the history of the laundry system. And so I'm just going to go through some of the objects that I'm collecting. So this is a spinner twin set, and it's much bigger than it looks. Above it is a pulley system that is used for actually lifting the laundry out from one to another or out into baskets. It's actually very, very large. There are reasons why I'm collecting each of these pieces, so we'll go through them as well. The reason for this is that this is very evocative of the physical labour that women had to go through and the effect that it would have had on their bodies in terms of sometimes quite small women managing these huge machines and huge weights. If you can think about how heavy wet textiles are, they're so much heavier than women can manage. So it was really very physically arduous on them. Next. Here's one of the pieces that makes for a beautiful photograph, but we can't take with us because it's been raining on top of it for quite a number of years now, and it's unsalvageable. It's covered in mould, the woodwork has rotted through, and the metal has been destroyed. So, great photograph, but we're going to have to leave it there. What we do get to take are the two presses. The one on the left, I think, is from the 1930s, 1937, and the one on the right is from 1957. So we're looking at this as a kind of a span of the ages of what work was going on. And there is one of the steam dryers, and just to give you some scale, there is my colleague Hannah, who is our conservator, and that is her. She's about an inch taller than me, so that's a really, really big dryer. So this is the kind of scale of the machines that we're talking about to go into whatever space that is that they are meant to go into. So yeah, that's definitely something that needs to be taken into consideration. This is the calendar machine. It's one of the more interesting ones for me because of how people talk about it. It's over 4 meters in length, but there's quite a lot of stories that Laura's collecting or histories. A lot of people talk about working on the calendar machine, and the things that kind of strike me about it is the fact that it's basically for sheets. So the sheets go in quite damp, they get steamed and pressed and rolled, and they come out semi-folded. But you would have to lift it up in the centre and slide your hand in, lift it up, and start folding from there. So what the women actually experience is burns on their hands and all up their arm whenever they're just. So we're looking at objects that we can tie into people's experience of working here and the physical marks that it left on it. It's just pieces that go with it. And of course then there's all of the supplementary material that go with it that makes the work. So we're looking at the processes. So we're looking at the fact that tables are needed, drying racks, metal trolleys to drag things around the place. Some of them are personalised. There's Maria's trolley. And also smaller pieces, which included quite a lot of religious artefacts, not all of them are still intact. We did actually get a hold of crucifixes, so they have been undergoing conservation at the moment. Everything that we take is quite a large commitment of resources of the museum into it. So for example, the crucifixes were covered in a kind of a white plaster, so we discovered that they had been painted underneath, but they had been covered in a kind of a white plaster material to blank them out, to remove the colour. But that has been peeling off with the damp and the dust, and there's ingrained dirt that's actually lint from the machines from the drying. So we're having that conversation of how much of that do we keep and how much do we get rid of. The piece there is just one of the photographs. I think you did that photograph, Laura. about the test archaeology and trenches.
Yeah, they had to go in and make sure there was no bodies underneath the ground.
Yeah, and I
Because
included-
of the controversies around unmarked grave, there wasn't.
But there was in Hyde Park, for example. So this is the kind of thing that we're very, very cognizant of, that this isn't just objects from the past, that we're actually dealing with a lot of human emotion tied up with this as well. Now, so the oral histories are witness testimonies that Laura's been collecting. So in many cases they have determined the choice of the artefacts. So the kind of general themes that are coming out of this kind of storytelling is about the process, so that it's structured and repetitive, and that the laundry work, the laundry work followed a system: washing, spinning, drying, pressing, and the systems. Each machine had its own system on top of that, and then there's a physicality that's included in all of this. And there's stories about the heat and the water, the smell, the steam. So the smell of carbonic soap features quite a lot, for example, and the weight of the wet textiles as they move around. And such things that we need to be careful of in museums and in reconstructing that, is that these things can be triggers for people who have been through traumatic experiences. So that's something that we need to be very mindful of in the kind of integration for telling the story. So the Sean McDermott Street for me represents the personal element of the history of the laundry system because of the women's boat dormitories. That's those right. So we've already seen the site, and I see it also as it's kind of a universal, so the experience of it is universal across all the sites across Ireland. There's a visual similarity. There's a similarity in all of the symbolism that we see. So these are photographs from similar institutions all across Ireland. And you can see that the themes, just the feel of them are very much the same. So it kind of says to me that we really need to have this site as something that is representative for everyone's experience. So no matter what institution they actually went into, that is something that they can all relate to. So I included the Acropolis Museum in Athens as a very good way of talking about what is absence and what is absent from what we have. Has anybody been to it? So the first thing I quite like about it is the fact that we were talking about footprints earlier. So they have actually managed to preserve the footprints. And this is a very common thing across archaeological sites. But there is absolutely no reason why we shouldn't incorporate that kind of thing into more modern sites as well. So when we were looking at the footprints earlier, that is the kind of thing that for me needs to be preserved. Also, what's very impressive about the Acropolis Museum is that it has designed for the absence. So you've all heard of the controversy over the Elgin marbles, or the Parthenon marbles, depending on which side you're on, about how in the reconstruction of the Parthenon on the inside of the museum, they left spaces for all of the missing marbles that are in the British Museum, on the expectation, maybe, that they will get them back. But really, they probably know that they won't, but what this is doing is highlighting the political and cultural issue that surrounds that. And so that's what makes that particularly impressive. So, the use of Sean McDermott Street. As a museum, we need to use the artefacts as testimony, or vehicles in which we can put forward the women's testimony. As an archive in waiting, so that's what I mean by designing for absence. We would like an archive. We don't know what kind of archive still remains. We don't know if we will ever get it. And if we don't get it, we may consider creating one, or the people, survivors themselves, creating one. And hopefully also as a library for educational space for learning and training. So we need to, with this space, meet community needs and meet some survivor needs. That's not what I mean by an archive. So what I'm just saying, that's the general archive of the Indies and Snow. But what we will be looking at is a space that people are comfortable using. So we need to actually ask, who is this for? Who are the users? It's very, very tempting to design huge, beautiful buildings, but it's the user that we need to think about at the end of the day. Another thing that is quite important when it comes to museum display is providing the visitor with individual choice. So in the display of sensitive materials, we need to make sure that people have a choice about whether or not they go into that. and I'll give you an example in a minute. We need to make sure that the message is not changed or sanitized. You might have read about the National Archives in Washington being in quite a lot of trouble over the last couple of days, I think, was it? It was in the last week. They put on an exhibition and they had photographs of the women's marches, the protest marches against Trump's inauguration. And they had blurred out Trump's name from signs in the crowd, and they had blurred out some images of, say, women's reproductive parts that were on signs. So they've been rightly sanctioned for changing what is historical fact, and they have replaced the images in the exhibition with the original images untouched. So it's very hard, it can be very tempting for museums to take the easy route and say, well, we don't want to insult or antagonise, and we might do just something a little bit different. But when it comes to such important things, it really is important that the message is not changed. So when it comes to individual choice, we have to make sure that the visitor access and flow must allow for the choice to not see what might traumatise. So, for example, that's not the right image because I couldn't get the right image, but in the museum we have human remains, and these are the display of human remains is very, very tightly controlled by policy. So what we did for the Bog Bodies exhibition was we placed each one in its own shell, if you like. So all of the learning, all of the textual and graphic information and learning takes place away from the bodies themselves. So we've got a number of the different shells inside the space. All of the information is outside, so you can go through the entire exhibition and learn everything you need to know about bog bodies without ever having seen one, unless you make that choice. So the visitor chooses whether or not to see the bodies themselves. Some people have issues with certain things, you can't predict what people will have issues with. Speaking of issues, this site needs to be of positive use, so to do something to help towards ensuring vulnerable people in today's society are less vulnerable and susceptible to any form of abuse. To do that, we have to recognise and explore current systems of abuse, and sites of difficult histories are traumatic, and we need to find the balance between teaching the history, remembering the survivors, and avoiding re-traumatising the survivors and their families. The other side of issues, there are other institutional systems to be covered in a laundry site, for example, industrial and reformatory systems. However, there are similarities between them which tie them together underneath the term institutional abuse. So other survivors must be brought on board with any such project. Everyone has different opinions about what form the memorial takes. And from working with survivors, I think we know that everyone has a very different opinion. Some people just want these places torn down, some people want very elaborate things done with them, and we have to listen to all of those opinions. But we have to remember, for many, memorial denotes that the problem is resolved, and that it only lives in history, and it doesn't take into account that the survivors and their families are still affected by the system. So memorials can be problematic because they suggest that the problem is gone, and that makes people quite angry because the problem is not gone. It's just moved into different formats. So just to finish up, museum buildings, when we're looking at this, just as my probably only chance ever to actually talk to architects who might be looking at the museum building instead of me having a fight with you in a few years. Museum buildings have to be fit for purpose, sustainable, controllable when it comes to environment and light. Designed with the museum's message in mind. So you have to bring the architecture and the site and the objects and people all together to form this structure. It has to work in conjunction with the collection. It's comfortable and inviting for people and flexible in use because you don't know how you might want to change things in the future. And that also brings us back to the point of not destroying anything because we might need it in the future. Or in 50 or 100 years, our successors will want them. So with this museum building is also a site of significant heritage value. They must also be preserved and respected, integrated into the fabric of the museum's message. And that means maybe including private spaces and spaces for reflection and discussion. Again, we just did an exhibition on the modern baby homes up in the National Museum of Ireland, and we had to be very aware of the fact that people would come through and be upset by its contents. So we had to set up systems so that people could go and get counselling, helplines, things like that, in a small space at the back where people could sit down. So it's not just a normal museum that we're looking at here, and there's really a lot of needs to be brought on board. That's it, I'm going to leave it for now. We'll go on this.
About the two lovely presentations. And so yeah, we'd just like to open the floor, and if anybody has anything they can think of.
I'll go.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask about something you mentioned about these spaces for the personnel to take a step out, and if something is maybe too much. I think that's really interesting because many of those kind of museums, I remember in Singapore, was a really interesting idea. And I wonder, is that a new thing, or is it something that's kind of always been there?
It's not always been there. Museums go through generational change, and they've gone from the whole cabinet of curiosities to the scientific displays for learning for particular classes of people to now being we are firmly in the museums are about people and for people. So everything we do, we have to have the visitor and the person at the centre of that. So it's definitely new, the idea of having spaces, but if you're dealing with such a topic, it's absolutely critical. But we've had people get in there and accept in the gallery.
And is that something you for survivors as well?
Yeah. So it's been very useful to be able to bring them around the corner and sit them down so that they can gather themselves in some peace.
Even in my local museum in Denmark, which was only built like 2 or 3 years ago, they put breaking spaces in it, but I think it's mainly for people with young kids if they get kind of overexcited by it all. But it's good anyway just to have that flexibility to be able to, to break out of places, because some of it can be quite full on, and especially when we're doing stuff like it. Actually, one of the things Brenda and I talked about is it might be an idea to be able to design the place so people can get through it without having to go through exhibition space. So not everybody has to go through, to see how the place is being presented. If they want to go to the archive, they don't have to go through a kind of museum and memorial aspect first. So just to have multiple means of accessing and moving around the site, so people don't have to be re-traumatized and they don't feel like going through it in a particular day. I think that's quite important to think about those multi-access routes.
Do you have something?
I was going to ask about graffiti in Command Jail. If there's any of it that particularly struck you, or any that was particularly interesting, or just the fact that it was there?
Oh god, there's loads of it. I took like 10,000 photographs when I was in jail for like a year. So it ruined my eyes. Again, it made them very dry. Because it's also, and again, this is the thing with these spaces. Like these, it's similar type of old buildings, but often quite chalky walls, small rooms. Like institutions like a Magdalene Laundry is not that different from a prison. So often it's about breaking down space into small units so you can control people, but also they're not nice spaces to be in. They're often quite dusty, they're quite, either over hot or over cold, which I can testify to. I have to spend a lot of time in that prison. But yeah, there was some really great graffiti. I've got a website if anyone wants to look, and I'm writing a book next year about it. But actually, interesting things around how things change. Like, I'm really interested in change, and I think this is what I keep coming back to with Magdalene Laundry, is our idea of what's important with these sites changes. And that can depend what comes out in records in 20 years or 30 years' time. It could depend on new collections appearing. And so one of the things I noticed with Kilmainham Jail is over time people who were heroes became villains. So the obvious one's Eamon de Valera, who, his name was everywhere, and then it started getting scored out, started getting graffiti written over it, and you could just see it over time, his kind of, he had the misfortune to live a long time and become a statesman, I suppose, and the rest of them died quite young and victoriously. So, yeah, so there was interesting seeing the interactions. I actually found weird stuff like UVF graffiti and stuff as well, which was a bit random. Which I think actually was some UVF men coming down in the 90s. So there's a lot of issues around layers, and I think again for any of these sites, layers is important. But that's whenever I see the walls and that convent with the, with the kind of the religious psalms and stuff on them, it reminded me of Kilmainham because there was quite a lot of that as well. People writing either phrases in Irish or religious phrases, and they were put over doorways. There's this kind of following architectural designs and actually being able to read the space how people move through it, which I thought was quite interesting. So, but the most interesting bit, which no one talks about, is the amount of British soldier graffiti in that prison. There's tons of it, and like I'd never known it was there until I went and found it. I'm like, what's all this stuff? And then realised half the prison is full of British soldiers graffiti. So. They were in there before the Easter Rising, and that is the bit I'm going to write the most about. I think it's the bit people don't talk about, but nothing to do with Magdalene Laundries.
I think just what occurred to me there when you mentioned Malone was the fact that when we were talking about the changes of use of the museum into the future, Malone is a good example of that. It was set up by the veterans in 1916, but it was set up in a very particular way. As those veterans die off, the management gets taken over, interpretation changes, and you need that kind of flexible space in order to do that. That's what the courts. It was all of that issue about the reimagining of the space there a few years ago for the anniversary. So yeah, I mean, you would see this as being somewhat similar in that it would reach its most potential if the survivors are part of the creation of the museum. But of course, survivors in any museum, say Robben Island, all of that, they pass on eventually, and the space has to change as history moves on. So you have to think about that in the original design of the museum as well.
And in terms of around material and immaterial, like, you know, a lot of heritage studies is focused on tangible and intangible, so tangible heritage being the material, but intangible being the meanings or the social practices or, you know, all sorts of random things. But what I found studying coming in jail was how some of the interactions were material in change, but a lot of them were immaterial. There were intangible changes, like the meaning changes, particularly as politics changed and our society changed. So at the end of the Troubles, there was less discomfort with a site like that. So then there was people like Pat Cook was the director then, and he was able to do more provocative stuff that they wouldn't have done in the political context before. So there's always this idea, you know, particularly, as I say, when survivors are there, then there's a certain, you know, amount you can do, and there's a certain degree of respect you have to not re-traumatizing people. But whenever a time moves on, then you have to think about if it's too kind of standoffish that it doesn't have any effect at all, then it has to maybe be, you know, amped up. And there's a kind of phrase in heritage studies about this, about hot interpretation, where, you know, you deliberately try and make it emotive, because if there's no emotional connection to it, then people just go there as a kind of a, you know, tick it off another site, and it shouldn't be that. It should be something that actually makes people uncomfortable and makes them you know, think about what the social injustice issues were then, but what they are now as well. So I think that's something we're really conscious of, that the site should not be kind of a dead site to things in the past, but also social injustice in the present. You know, we have direct provision, we still have people who are held in horrible conditions without having committed any crimes. So, you know, we have to think about how do these sites talk to the present as well as the past.
You quickly mentioned direct provision there. I kind of have a short question about kind of the relationship that the Magdalene Laundries, how they were perceived in their time, as contrast with direct provision now. So at the time of Magdalene Laundries, there seemed to be sort of an underlying, people kind of knew what was going on but didn't necessarily speak about it. Or was that something that was...
There was an acceptance of it, that it was a necessary thing in society. You still hear it a lot. We've had visitors come into the space and say things like, sure, where else would these women have gone? The church did them a favour. So there's still a lot of that attitude around. So that would have been a very common attitude at the time that they were operating. I'm remembering that they didn't stop operating until the 90s. So, 96. So it's still something, it's still an attitude that we hear a lot of.
And yeah, it's something we've studied actually in Denmark as well, is around the movement of marginalisation. So, you know, lower class women in particular were the most marginalised people, so they were the easiest to put into laundries for a variety of reasons, often for, you know, being fostered or being, you know, orphaned or being just poor and, you know, just moving around from institution to institution. So there's still this kind of shaming idea that most women who were in the laundries were, you know, had children out of wedlock, but they didn't. You know, that's just a kind of perception. Like mother and baby homes and laundries were the same thing. So a lot of, you know, a lot of the women we talked to were just moved around. They were in care systems, you know, from quite a young age, and were just at some point moved into a laundry, and that was that. And some of them got to leave, some of them didn't get to leave. So I think this is kind of, people don't really like to look into marginalised people. So, you know, people in direct provision are the most marginalised, I would say, in our society. And, you know, we're happy just to not really think about it and to put our hands up and move on. Whereas, you know, there's always going to be the next level of marginalisation, and sometimes that's based on race, sometimes on gender, sometimes on age. So I think it's always important to, you know, to think about, you know, who are the people that we're kind of happy to not think about what their experience is and what they're doing. And like there's a lot, because now we have a lot more social media, like there's lots of accounts that look into direct provision and show us photographs and videos of what people's lives are like. It's really, I think it should be quite hard now to completely avoid that kind of stuff, but you know, back in the day, even, like my family grew up in Belfast and, you know, in working class areas, and my mum tells me that, you know, she was told at a young age, like, don't be bad or you're going to go to the Magdalene Laundry. So everybody knew that it was there and it was behind a wall, but they didn't look any further. They just were like, that's where unfortunate people go and you don't want to meddle in it. So, you know, and I suppose there was also that fear amongst, you know, lower working class people that that's where you end up as well. So you just didn't really do too much with that.
I think there was also a lot of complicity in society. I worked in Dangan in the Reformatory School. It's under the National Museum of Ireland as well for 4 years, so it was around the time that the report was released. And so I met a lot of survivors coming back and telling their story that the release of the report had kind of risen it up and then they wanted to do something to feel some kind of resolution. But I learned a lot about the history of what was going on between them and the community. So while it always looked like there was big walls around the institution and never the twain shall meet, actually the community used to go in there for Mass on a Sunday, theatre, they would come in and watch the theatre shows that were on in the play hall, but most importantly a lot of the kids were actually rented out to local farmers as slave labour. So, and that's not something that we talk about very often as well. It's very easy, I bang on about this a lot, I know, but it's very easy to blame church and government, but society has to take its share of the blame as well, because certainly society did benefit greatly from the institutionalisation of our marginalised people. I think Brenda and Kelly said that we were possibly, at least in Europe, we were like the most institutionalised country. We put the most people away over the last 100 or 200 years.
I think the 1950s kind of played it.
On that, I read a statistic this morning that 40% of the girls in Sean McDermott Street had been brought there by their families, and so their families brought them there to get them out of the way, and they weren't all, you know, working class and lower class. You know, some of them were middle class.
Yeah, but some of them usually got out. You know, usually if you had a family, you know, there is a lot of. It's really hard to tell exactly what happened because we don't have the records because you know they haven't been open. But they're like not everybody was in there forever. So you know, a lot of women I spoke to, you know, got out in their early 20s. You know, and some of them went in really early, you know, 11 and 12 and stuff like that. So some women were sent, you know, were put in there by their families and would be taken out in a year or two. And we just don't really know actually how long everybody was there. But there was women there for 60, 70 years. We know that from the census records, some of them appeared time after time. But yeah, it's really hard to say. But definitely the middle classes used them as Magdalene laundries in the 19th century as well, which is where you put, you know, wayward kind of young ladies. So it was kind of a punishment, and also to take them away from whatever they were doing outside. There was also issues of, you know, girls who were, you know, who were sexually assaulted or abused were put into Magdalene laundries as a means of kind of punishing them for whatever happened to them, and often that was within families as well. So that, you know, happened within middle class families, but I think the majority were working class and were working class involved from trying to bring together the evidence from things like, you know, the work that was being done in the children's homes and the reports in them, and then how many women, you know, girls segued into the Magdalene laundries from that. It was quite an open process of, you know, you get to a certain age and then you're big enough to go to the laundry and do some work there. So, but yeah, it's hard to tell. If we ever get the records open, we might have a better idea. But we're just working with anecdotes, and maybe people that came forward at this stage are just, you know, electoral rolls and census records, which we don't have a lot of. So.
And again, there's just some, anecdotal evidence of some people who, let's say, born in a mother and baby home, ended up in a laundry at a young age, and then entering the mental asylum system as well. So there's this cross-culture of just moving people through the systems. For men, it was generally you end up in an industrial or reformatory school. You come out, your chances of ending up in prison were so much higher than if you hadn't been. So that all of that is intriguing as well. So we're talking about a very, very complicated system. earlier by saying there are lots of different systems of use, and if you focus on just one, everyone else being excluded will come It's again, it would be another example of the state shutting the doors.
I was thinking a little bit about research and findings and collections that you guys and other people do, and then in connection to this, how we display it in a museum, for example. But also, I was wondering a little bit if you guys have any thoughts on, now that there's also so many different ways of kind of educating the public and giving the information, making the information available to the public when it comes to like social media and such.
Yeah, I think also, we have so many kind of modes that we can work with now digitally that we don't need to be focused just on the kind of, physical sites. I think physical sites are really important, obviously. As I said, as an archaeologist, I'm slightly obsessed with it. But not everybody can go to the site, not everybody wants to go to the site. We can do a lot of stuff working digitally. I've talked to, a colleague who's an architect up at Queen's, and his PhD is going to focus on, kind of creating 3D models of some of these sites and then, tying stories to them. So if we have things like, the oral testimonies from the Justice for Magdalene's archive and some of the stuff I've done, a lot of it's very specific to place. So whenever I did oral testimonies, I did them with people on site. So as we walked around, they talked about, what they remembered. So it wasn't set on questions, it was set on just interacting with the site. And I didn't film them because I've done that once. Whenever I was doing work in the Mayor's prison, they asked me to be like a guinea pig and go around and do it, and you get really conscious of being filmed. So I decided not to, but just to have a kind of microphone, but then just take pictures of the things that were talked about so we kind of trace where we went. And so you can use that then to kind of, create something online that people can move through the space, that they can hear the stories connected to certain places. There's a lot of interesting stuff we can do that doesn't just have to be grounded in a physical space, because, it opens up a lot more people engaging with it. But it also means that we can do, more imaginative and creative stuff where we can't, just decide to kind of build these stray walls or change things. But, whenever we're working with things that, we're creating online, we can do something slightly different with it. We can create online museums, we can use artifacts and move them about, we can, look at where the stories tie into places, and even multiple stories that might have slightly different things being said about the same place. So the kind of sky's the limit and stuff like that, which is really good. And we're getting better at doing that stuff now as well. It's not so expensive and it's not so difficult to do. So I think it's something to think about whenever you're looking at how to work with a space. Like, how do you work with a space online? How do we actually do something with that to communicate it outside of the actual confines of the site? Like a lot of museums that use, have big web presences have done studies of this, and they found that a lot of people use websites for sites before or after, not usually when they're in the site. So, people prepare for visits to sites by looking at what's going on online. If they're particularly interested, they'll go and look up again to see what went on. So it has a kind of extended life for a visit as well, which I think would be quite important.
It's not necessarily an extended visit unless it's physically impossible to get there. And digital humanities has come on in such leaps and bounds. You would, if you had the records, you could envisage something like tracing people's movement from area to area across Ireland, because you've seen all of the different homes and types of institutions that there were, and people moved across them. And if we had the information, it would be amazing to create a kind of web of relationships between people and institutions. I'm not sure we'll ever get that, but
Well,
there's
actually, there's a project at Malone starting on that about countermapping the carceral environment of Ireland and looking at where historically institutions were and actually where direct provision is now, where it continually moves around as well. And it's the same kind of system, like, government institutions have good memories. Like, you move people about when you're trying to disrupt how they connect to place and how they feel, connection. It kind of feels safe as well. So continually moving someone around is a good way of making them not want to stay somewhere, which is pretty much what direct provision is about. So they're doing that kind of counter mapping of looking historically where all these institutions were, and then looking where things are now and how, you know, places pop up, disappear, move around, and then try to actually create an interactive map on that. That's geographers and many who are doing that now.
Yeah, so, I mean, yeah, the possibilities are endless. I'm a museum person though, so for me, look, in fairness, I mean, you've seen the amount of stuff that's out in Donnybrook. I'm not collecting at all, I'm collecting representative samples. So I've been very restrained on the collecting part of it. But for me, it is, I've seen people interacting with objects, and there is something special that happens with a person and an original artifact. And you can't just replace that with digital humanities. It's all supplementary to each other. Now, one is not more important than the other, but certainly the idea of somebody in 100 years, a relative, maybe a descendant of somebody that was in one of these laundries coming in and touching a machine, and that would be all for these machines being touched, that their ancestor or friend or relative had worked on is a very unique experience. When people come into the museum, I often do behind the scenes stuff, where I take people into the stores for their particular interests and take out the objects and they handle them with gloves, because it's a unique experience. So yeah, I would still be putting objects in there, just not all everything.
I just I know in Donnybrook we have to trial trenches for mass graves. Is that being done in Sean McDermott
I don't think so. No. Well, I think it was done in Donnybrook because they were trying to get planning permission, so they had to prove there was no graves there. But it's kind of a bit static at the minute in Sean McDermott Street. So, and it depends how much they know already. Sometimes they know where the graves are, and sometimes they don't. Like, you know, again in Donnybrook it was done very thoroughly, but I don't think there was ever going to be graves inside the building, so they did it very thoroughly, you know, just to make sure. And any anomalies that came up in the kind of, you know, kind of identifications they used, they just went and dug just to make sure, so they had to be 100% sure there was nothing there. But yeah, and I think it's because whenever they put in the first planning permission, there was a protest put in that possibly there were graves there, and that's why they had to do it, just to be 100% sure. But I don't think it's been done in Sean McDermott Street.
I'd say they're just not at that stage.
No.
It may have to
Yeah,
happen in building works to help. But in Donnybrook, the graveyard for the site is identified.
Yeah, you can actually see it.
And I had the same experience in Dangan where there was somebody said that there were bodies buried in the grounds, but I had actually identified where the burial ground was, so we didn't feel the need to do however many acres it is to find bodies. So, but it's a very, it's very, very sensitive subject, and all it takes is somebody to say that there could be bodies there to bring everything to a rushing halt.
Just to add on to that, when we were at the site, the person who was giving us the tour from the council, I did ask him if there were bodies buried. He said they had done a few studies,
Okay.
and that there wasn't any evidence of it, because he said that most of them did get buried at Hyderabad, but they did do a few things, but I didn't have detail on it.
Didn't see any evidence. Sometimes they say, well, they might have done the study and just not seen any anomalies that suggest graves.
Yeah.
I don't, like, generally there's kind of a knowledge of human beings. Like, I think the problem with Donnybrook is that people, the women who had been in there in the 60s and 70s, didn't, you know the confines of the current site. So the current site pretty much cut off just where the building was, but they knew there was a burial ground further over. They just didn't know that wall had been there in between. So the burial ground is identifiable, and it's in the grounds where the convent is, but they didn't know that's where the wall was, so they just knew there was graves somewhere close by. So I think that's why they had to be really thorough, but actually, you know, if they had seen the boundary, they probably would have known it wasn't open street.
So they'd never seen the boundary because they were within the wall. They were,
No, they had left
had
before that
experience.
wall was put
Oh, okay.
up. You see, the wall was put up in the early 90s, and it was sold. The reason why Donnybrook's in such good state of repair is because it was sold to an industrial laundry, which only closed about 5 years ago. So they were still using the same equipment, and I guess we can see there was dates in some of it, but you know, it's really obviously really old stuff, a lot of it. So, and they hadn't taken the crosses off the wall and the plinths and stuff. It was really weird. Like, they'd been working for about 15 years and they just hadn't changed it. So, which was great for us. So you went in and it just looked like a Magdalene Laundry. But that wall had been put up just at the point when they sold it in 1992. So a lot of the women had left before then, so they didn't know where the wall was. So they just knew that the site was bigger and that there was a graveyard further across. So.
It can happen. I've had people coming to Dangan who had been there as a young boy or an older boy. So this site is segregated between them, and I did notice that they all had different knowledge of a particular part of the site, but no knowledge of the rest of it. So it was like a jigsaw puzzle, putting everything together. And that's just about how they were confined in these spaces, that they might not actually know what's on the other side of that door because they wouldn't have been through it, even with years of being there.
And like people have faulty memory. It's not like, you know, it's not deliberate, but people just remember things differently. Like whenever I brought some of the women back onto the site, like just one of them just couldn't remember anything. You know, she just walked around and went, I actually just don't remember any of this. And she got really quite upset because she thought she'd remember it really well. But, you know, shock and time and everything else can change how you remember stuff. And it doesn't mean that, you know, there's any dishonesty in your stories, but it just means that you just don't remember what happened because it was too traumatic, because it was too long ago, because too many other things had happened in between. So. Like one of the women, I think you met, you know, had a really quite good memory, but she had like went on to own her own laundress in England. So she loved talking about the laundry machine. Where the other woman just didn't really have anything to say about that, and just wanted to sit down and have a smoke and tell me about her life, and that was fine. You know, we did that as well. So probably a little bit dangerous on that side with all the flint and stuff that was about it. But you know, there's just, that's why, you know, we generally don't put kind of victims from a long time ago on stands and trials. Their memory is not like factual. It kind of wavers and it changes with what happens to them in the present. So, but I think it's kind of interesting just how the site kind of created these really strong responses that didn't often come back into telling us factual stories about the site, but more about feelings of it, what it was like, what the heat, the light, you know, how they moved through it, where they couldn't go, where they could go. So it wasn't really factual accounts of this is how this machine worked. It was more, you know, just trying to remember stuff that happened to them, very specifically, small little details. It was very interesting, but very, you couldn't predict what people were going to say.
I think that's what came out of your work, is the idea of process and systems that were imposed on them.
Yeah, because one of the things I found, I really wanted to do it where it was just people being directed by the site, but I could figure out that they were really uncomfortable with that, like they wanted someone to talk to as they walked around. So we ended up, I'm in it quite a while, I'm chatting away, because I could just see they were uncomfortable. But often if you ask them how something worked, that's when they were really comfortable. They went, oh, okay, let me tell you, this table here, we did this, we moved around here, that happened here. And some of the best stories came out of those kind of bits where you were just asking them to talk about something because they were getting distracted or they were getting kind of a bit lost. And then they'd be very specific about the processes of how they did stuff, and then they'd tell you something about how the nuns acted, or you know, how they were controlled, or who they were allowed to speak to, or who they weren't. So there was a weird process of getting interesting stories. It was a very interesting process, but like it'll be good for communicating what happened at different points. But yeah, it's not exactly like none of them were what I think they were going to be, so it was interesting. Still not quite sure what I think about some of it.
So as a foreigner, I think the challenge for me has been assessing sort of what my place is commenting on culture I don't really understand. So what would be your advice to us in the room who are from a different country, sort of how we should approach an architectural solution here? Because the last thing I want to do is produce something insensitive.
That is a really tricky. I suppose you'd have a different perspective, but from a museum perspective, if I was putting on an exhibition for, and actually I do it all the time, putting on an exhibition where part of your target audience is foreigners, so you're trying to figure out where your base knowledge is, and it's usually quite low even among your, say, Irish population, especially if you're trying to correct myths, and I think that probably relates to here as well, is that good correction of myth needs to be taken into account. And so the advice is always that you just go for the facts. the truth and correct any myths that have come about in the years since, from a museum point of view.
Well, I would say from a 20th century history point of view, like most countries had institutions where they institutionalised marginalised people. So, like, I don't know where you're from. Sorry, where are you from?
Australia.
Australia had Magdalene Laundries as well, so, and they're still there. Yeah, Melbourne. I actually read a PhD on the good Shepherd Magdalene Laundry in Melbourne. There was quite a lot, and they institutionalised, Indigenous people, but also, again, lower working class people, or people who didn't have, anybody to look after them. So I can actually point you in the direction if you're interested. But like, it was seen as a kind of how do you deal with marginalised people, or difficult people, or people you want to control. So. You find that all over the kind of global north, but actually everywhere. So, like, I study colonial institutions as well. So, colonialism institutions hand in hand. How do you control people? How do you stop them doing stuff you don't want them to do? You just create asylums and prisons and Magdalene laundries and everything else, and you give it to the church to do as well. And that's in Australia that happened a lot actually. Just give it to the Catholics to look after. So you can actually find this probably anywhere you come from. There's a similar story. Like I live in Denmark now, which you would think is like progressive, kind of socialist society. They love institutionalized people as well. Like there's a workhouse museum in southern Denmark we've spent time at that is really interesting in how they're dealing with it, particularly around contemporary issues of people who've been through the care system in Denmark in recent years and institutionalized abuse.
Yeah, and how they interact then with the museum to create and deal with their own histories.
Exactly, and like the intergenerational issues with that, often, they work with people who are now, have issues with homelessness, drug addiction, other things, and often they came through the care system, and there's intergenerational, interaction with the care system. So, everywhere has this. So it's just kind of in Ireland we've had it in such a degree that we had to kind of deal with it, but actually lots of places don't really deal with it.
When the reports were first published back in 2007, I think was the first. There were camera crews arriving in Dangan from all around the world going, oh, it's terrible that this happened in this country. I mean, just what is it about this country that this happened in? So, look, you had institutions, your stories will come out. And of course, they have since. And it would be a real, it's a real possibility with digital humanities again, in terms of actually linking. It's not just an Irish story or a woman's story or a children's story, but to link it across the whole world. How institutionalised people, like America, for example, now has the most institutionalised or imprisoned population in the whole world. So, and the way it's dealing with it in some museums is quite interesting. How it's not dealing with it is even more interesting. But there's such huge possibilities there that if you start something that you can link in with institutions across the world to actually look at this topic.
We were speaking a little bit earlier about the provision, and so that's something that kind of relates to this, but it's a current thing, not like a contemporary thing. And is it correct if you have gathered things from the Repeal the 8th movement? Yeah. I was wondering a little bit how we went about doing that.
Citizen revolution, and I went on Twitter and I asked them.
That's how I found you.
Yeah, that's well, you have to put a structure on things. So curatorially, you're going to manage the process. So you're identifying trends through, for example, campaigns and through the history. So you can identify what you want, what is the material culture, and then you can kind of go after it. But you do have to then just be very careful to make sure that what you got is representative. It's not everything, you can't collect everything. So there is an element of almost project managing the citizens, but the citizens kind of make the decision about what was the material culture, what was important. So, and then you can apply that, you kind of have to apply that for a lot of contemporary history. Because, again, you mentioned it earlier about how it can be quite difficult to, we're making decisions in the present about what's important in the present to preserve. But we have to also be mindful of the fact that there are other opinions out there, and also that you can't just simply be wrong about stuff. So you have to get out there and ask people and get other people involved.
And I think also museums probably have to look at how sustainable it is to have collections that don't get sorted at some stage as well. Like I know there's increasingly, moves between having disposal schedules as well as retention schedules. And also be really careful with the politics of that. In Denmark there was discussion about just getting rid of all foreign stuff. And you're like, yeah, that's a little bit problematic. Especially when you have colonies and you want to get rid of all the foreign stuff. But just thinking about, does this have a connection to our national identity? Do we have too many of certain things? Because you can't accumulate all the time and just never get rid of stuff. But it's it's a difficult decision to make. If you're bringing in new collections, what do you do with old collections? So,
one way I've dealt with it is I brought in items and not registered them. You just kind of don't. But because if you register something, then you have acquired it, and if you've acquired it, you have to go through a deaccession and disposal palaver is the only word for it really. So if you, say in the last election, I was collecting a few bits and bobs thinking, oh, this might be interesting in the future. But I'm just going to set it aside, so I'm going to box onto the desk in my office. My office is just crammed with stuff. Maybe I'll acquire this in a few years, maybe I'll register it into the system, and then it stays forever. But we do have a schedule of looking at it every 5 years. So you do kind of, like for the Donnybrook material, I was dragged into a committee to justify why I'm collecting this, because it is such a huge drain on resources, and you've seen the size of the machines. They were very, very supportive, but obviously it's a lot of money just to have something sitting on the ground in one of your stores, and people kind of forget that. So I had to be very, very careful. I think I've actually deselected some pieces that were in the photographs. Again, mainly because now they've deteriorated to such a point where they're going to take even extra resources to try to fix them. But yeah, we have to be really, really cognizant of what we take into the collections, knowing that in 2 weeks' time something else really important might show up, and we don't have that much space. But I will be registering them, I promise. It's just the leaflets that of certain, trends that you see politically that you might say, no, it didn't work out the way, or it didn't happen the way I thought it might, so it's no longer important. So if you think something might happen, say that there's going to be a huge green surge and the Greens will win in the next election, which will be quite big, then yes, I would have all the material to tell that story, or for my successors to tell that story in 50 years is really where I'm coming from. But then if it doesn't happen, then I don't need those leaflets of green candidates. I can just toss them in the bin without having to deaccession.
Winners write history.
What?
Winners write history.
There is an element of that, yeah, but it's a case of you have to sit down and just really think out what just happened here, and how will people in 50 years tell that story.
Is the state funded project?
In many ways.
What, the Donnybrook?
Donnybrook.
The whole museum thing is
It's state funded, so it's a semi-state institution, but we're fully state funded. So it is taxpayers' money that goes into acquiring and looking after this. So it's one of the other reasons why you have to be extra careful how you spend it.
But we have made sure the developers at Donnybrook can pay for quite a lot of stuff.
Yes.
They have to pay for my expertise, they have to pay to decontaminate things.
They have to remove the asbestos.
Yeah.
So that's actually quite costly, so they can bear that cost.
And they're going to pay to remove the equipment, which is gigantic and really hard to get out. So yeah, if they're getting our help with their planning process, they're paying for everything. So, and we had to really think about that. Like there's huge ethical issues with like working with developers, but pretty much I've been involved in too many sites that conveniently disappeared over time, like the Maze prison. So I just thought, sometimes you just have to go in and do stuff, because otherwise it's not going to get done properly, or it's not going to get done the way we have any kind of collections out of it. So, and like they really wanted to just throw it all and do a skip and get rid of it. So
I wanted to skip big enough.
Yeah, exactly. Well, they had huge skips.
They were quite grateful that I came along and said, I'll take that calendar machine.
But like over the time, like just to give you some indication, like there was people breaking into the site, so like urbexers and stuff, videos all over YouTube if you're interested. But over a couple of months, like all the sinks disappeared from that site, and like lots of the religious statues disappeared. We had really interesting configurations of things that were very attractive that then just disappeared, and we're like, right, we're just going to have to take this stuff out of the site. Like I found a handmade bell that had been made with, you know, a nail which had something, you know, wire pulled around it, and then a handmade little kind of gong in it. And I just thought, oh, that's lovely, I'll just put that up there, and it was gone by the next time we come back to the site. So we have photographs of objects that have never been brought into the collection because someone stole them in between. So that's slightly annoying, I have to say. So sometimes you have to think your ethics. Screw the ethics, just get them out of there before someone steals them. You know, all those beautiful things are in some lovely houses in D4 probably. Yeah, exactly.
One of my big fears is that the place will be set on fire before we actually get the machinery out. And we would have had the machinery out about 4 months ago if it wasn't for the fact that the testing came back positive for asbestos. So that was a killer. That just put the kibosh on everything in terms of actually moving the stuff out. And being in the winter as well then, because there's no electricity, we won't run water through the site. So,
It's getting more decrepit.
yeah. So, and also that means you can't put people work on. So myself and Hannah, the girl in the photograph, we were all kitted out for, we had hazmat suits and brushes to clean up the burnt guana of the machines, and then we got word back that it was asbestos next day. So we had to plug on it.
Just out of curiosity, do you know why there was such like they focused on laundry, like why that was the thing they did? Is it like,
Oh yeah, it's also because you don't need to educate people to work in laundries. So you don't want to give them an education, but you want them to make money. So if you get a lot of women into doing washing for you, you can make a lot of money out of that, but you don't have to teach them to read and write, so they can't kind of, you know, get themselves educated enough not to want to be there. So a lot of the women who I spoke to, you know, still have problems reading and writing because they were never really taught how to, so they just had to try and pick it up themselves. So yeah, it's a really good way of getting people to do a lot of work to get paid for, and you know, to physically take up a lot of their time, and they're really tired and things as well, but you don't actually have to put in anything into their education. So, and they, like, you know, we know quite a lot of evidence that like those laundries were making huge amounts of money, and you know, also because they were working behind the scenes. So you know, private laundries on the high street were often using them because you can't really do cheaper than slave labour, you know, people who aren't getting paid to do the job. So, you know, we found bags and stuff in the site of other laundrettes. So they would have like sent their laundry in, and then it would have went out in a bag from a different shop, so that people didn't even know they were using Magdalene laundries, even though they were. But some of them did, like, you know, there was a door you could walk in from the local neighbourhood. Yeah, there's a lot of, we found some great artifacts, you know, like cases with like arsenic thrown on it, things like that. So, you know, the president got his laundry sent into Donnybrook, so things like, which great, you're like, wow, you couldn't even dream about this kind of stuff.
Local embassies were another big users of the Magdalene.
Yeah, like hospitals, hotels, restaurants, all of them. There's a lot of interaction between the religious orders who ran hospitals and who ran Magdalene Laundry Site. You know, they kind of work back and forth. So it's a very well organised corporation.
Since then, we've also started collecting items that kind of trying to tell the story of what happened to them afterwards in terms of how they were trying to get information about themselves. Again, we're just starting on this, so usually what happens is if something becomes public, like a museum, then suddenly the material will start flowing in. So things are quite slow at the moment. We did have some stuff come in because of the Alison Lowry exhibition on our baby homes, but one interesting piece for me anyway that came in was a woman who just came in with a big bag of stuff, and she just said, she just started talking. She couldn't write any of it, she didn't know how to read or write. She just started talking, and we were taking all of this stuff. It was all that little piece of that cheap cut glass, like little condiment jars and perfume jars and stuff like that. The kind of thing that you have on dressing tables and in cabinets in your parlour. And I asked her, where's all of this come from? She says, well, every time I went back to the nuns to ask for my files and where I came from, every time I was refused, and every time they refused me, I stole something from the convent. And these are all these little glass things. So all of those little glass things now, instead of just being cheap stuff that you find in your grandma's has become the wall that she was up against in terms of finding out about her own identity. identity, and each piece represents a time that she was turned away. So,
I find that old ex-prisoners did that thing that just stole stuff all the time. I've just seen it as like their subversion against the state. It's like, just steal something.
Good question. Just at the back of the laundry site on Sean McDermott Street, there was some section of foundation where there was like timber and stone. It wasn't like the concrete
Is
foundation.
that back at the walls, or is it
Close to it there, yeah. And I just wasn't sure if there's somewhere in Donnybrook that had a similar thing that we might know what it was used for.
Well, again, because the Donnybrook site was cut off, so
Yeah.
you know we just lost the whole landscape of that site.
Okay.
So, and like there was even buildings put in since that was closed. So, a lot of the women who worked in Donnybrook, you know, they had their dormitories behind there, which were also knocked down. But then they built a nursing home, and they all just moved in there, and they had a view back under the laundry, which must have been really lovely for them. But you know, we just had that whole site's disappeared. We don't really know what was, you know, literally it's like the entrance to the laundry, the wall, they just didn't leave any spare space there. So they were literally selling the laundry, they weren't selling any land with it. So it's hard to tell what's going on with those sites, sorry.
such sites though, I mean, that a lot of them are very self-contained. It's bakeries and things like that. The industrial and formative schools often had farms with them, little farms attached. So, and they were like little cities behind a wall. So really,
And like workshops and stuff, like they like to make their own really terrible furniture, which we have lots of in Donnybrook, and love painting blue as well, as we know, so keeps the flies off, also in Caribbean. So we're wondering why everything was blue, and we're like, is it because of Mary, or is it because of flies? Probably. And probably really cheap paint as well. So you've probably seen that in one of the pictures, there was like a clothes room, a lot of blue furniture that all looks handmade, and so they would have made a lot of blue furniture.
I think the thing you were talking about was a floor. It was the floor of the laundry. Yeah, and I'm not sure whether, I wondered at first whether there was a basement under, or it was, there was like timber and stone in between.
I think if you looked up about outside of the context of Magdalene Laundries, just about process, I think they're probably leveling screens, which are about laying the floor level and then having mount. I think so lots of industrial processes. So where, like, actually you can see throughout the building where you mount things. You will mount it to the concrete. You might be mounting it on those timber screens, which are set level, and then you can level. I suspect that's what it's about. Something to do with how that works.
Or even for a timber floor.
Possibly for a timber floor fixed down to it. Yeah, I'm not sure. Yes, it could be that actually as well, like a very heavy, you know what I mean, heavy duty floor.
Just the stone was quite unusual, I thought, in between.
I thought it was. Oh, actually, there's brick between as well. There's concrete in places. There's brick in other. Yeah, it's funny. Yeah, it's some sort of subfloor, which is Can I ask you? Sorry, I missed earlier. You probably talked about why you think, or maybe that's they're not releasing the records.
They don't want anybody to notice how much, just, you know, the scale of it, I'm pretty sure.
But I suppose it's
Like particularly the financial stuff, they're really cagey about that. Like Jim Smith, who wrote a book about Magdalene Laundry about 10 years ago, like he got access to some of the financial records in Galway by mistake because one of the archivists gave it to him and didn't realise he wasn't supposed to get it, and they absolutely put a block with him publishing any of that stuff, so even though he's seen it, he wasn't allowed to publish it. And so the person, like, well, we have a colleague who's doing a lot of contact with the nuns connected to Donnybrook to see about getting access to materials. It's been going on for about 1.5 years, 2 years. First of all, there was nothing. Then there was only stuff that can't be open to the public because of GDPR stuff. Then it turns out there is stuff, but you know, still won't really let you have access. Then they let him in to look at some of the stuff. And then that nun disappeared off and there's a new one starting, so the whole process is going to start again. So we're not, like, you know, we just don't know how much they got or how much, like, but they claimed they had no records and we knew that wasn't true. And then it wasn't true, you know, they did have records. But the records connected to the women and the records connected to finance are the ones that are just not letting anyone see. They wouldn't, you know, they claimed they had no records connected to the buildings and how they were created as well, but we think they probably do have some.
But just as regards Sean McDermott Street, There's Jacinta Prunty has written a book, and they gave her access to the.
She's a nun, isn't she?
She is a nun. She's also a respected academic.
Oh, I know, but I mean, she got access because she's a nun, like,
Yeah.
because that's what, you know, our colleagues said to them when we noticed records here, because, you know, Jacinta Prunty's got access to these, and they went, oh, well, yeah, okay, there was some stuff. But, you know, they claimed there was nothing until he kind of pointed out that obviously there was stuff. But they wouldn't give access to any of us. You know, that's kind of not bad.
But her work on it is worth reading, particularly for us, with regard to Sean McDermott Street, because she describes the building and the intention of why certain things were built where they were and what time they were built at and all that. There's a few chapters on Sean McDermott Street.
Oh, yeah, no, it's very well.
Can there not be like a way of just using like freedom of information, like to ask them?
No, they're not being pushed.
Why is the church exempt from all these things?
Publicly owned, so government papers.
Just
They didn't hold records either, it was all the church.
the oral history issue. Have you ever considered or has everyone proposed to take one of a nun's who worked in these or if that's they're like sealed off from giving their opinion?
Like we would,
Or what would
like
be
I
the
would
point
have,
of
but I was actually told not to talk because whenever I was doing work at Donnybrook, I was really open to anybody who had any connection to the site. And I spoke to somebody who has connections to the nuns, and she just said to me, "Don't tell them until you're finished, and they'll stop you being able to do this." So, like I have an aunt who's great aunt who was a nun not in one of the laundries, but you know in Dublin, and I have some connections there, so I've no problem with talking to the nuns. But you know we've just been told to be really careful because they'll just close down your access. So, like there is still women who are in the the Donnybrook convent who were in the laundry, and I've spoke to different people about talking to them, and they were kind of yeah, and it just kind of closed off. So there's a lot of kind of finding out what was going on, I think, but there was just not an openness to doing it. And like as I said, I don't direct them, I just walk around with people and let them talk about whatever. I think that's the most interesting thing. Like I worked in the Maze prison and I spoke to ex-prisoners of all descriptions. I talked to people who worked there, I talked to governors and prison officers. I don't really have an agenda with it, I just want to know what people have to say. But there just doesn't seem to be an openness to be involved in it. Maybe in future, but like I don't know how many months are going to be around to do that in future. So
I did have a member of the order who ran St. College in Bangor did come out to visit us after the report was published, and they were just really very angry about the whole thing. So there was not going to be any kind of useful communication about it. So you just had to let them be angry, and that was that. To tell me some stuff. Anyway.
When we had the tour of the site, the man mentioned that a lot of the people from the community, when they were younger, in the schools surrounding used the grounds, and they actually had very fond memories of it, which is obviously not something you really want to hear because you don't want that to take away from any of the trauma that happened there. But did you have any experience talking to any people like that, or do you think that should be addressed in relation to it?
Brendan O'Carroll was in Dungan, and he said he had a grant on it. And then you speak to other people, like Don Baker was there, and he talks about how he was beaten on the steps. So he's got different people have very different memories, different people have very different experiences. There are some universal experiences, and I think it's probably more in the Magdalene system, in terms of the slave labour abuse. So I think you're going to get less positive stories out of the Magdalene system.
And I also find talking to some of the women that they have a kind of a moral imperative not to give pleasant stories because they don't want people that have pleasant stories of it, which I thought was kind of interesting. So when I was doing the oral testimonies, one of the women who I spoke to, very strong personality, like she wanted to start it at the gate and she wanted to tell me her story first. So she didn't want to be, she didn't mind being affected by the buildings as we walked through, but she wanted to have a story set down and she wanted to tell me how terrible it was. And at points, she would start to tell me anecdotes about something kind of funny that happened, and then she'd stop herself and go, yeah, but it wasn't nice, so don't distort what I've said. Like that wasn't our experience. Like that's one nice anecdote, because I think they were wary that sometimes stories of, you know, comradeship or whatever were kind of misconstrued as being, oh, it was just jolly and lovely and everyone had a nice time. So they're really quite conscious of not wanting you to have those stories, which I think over time that might balance out, and that's what I'm thinking of in terms of like 20 years, 50 years in the future. There probably will be different interpretations of what went on, but at the minute I think the women just feel that their story hasn't been sufficiently settled in the society, and they don't want to muddy it with stories that are, you know, ambiguous, that might say that actually it wasn't so bad, or maybe their families were worse, or whatever. So I noticed that you know, that they didn't want to kind of dwell on good things, even if they kind of came out with it, they'd stop themselves and go, actually no, I don't want to tell you that, which is fine, which I thought again was interesting in itself. I think they're just really wary of it being distorted and then presented as some kind of nice, you know, kind of boarding school or something, which it really wasn't. So,
Well, what a lot of the men told me in Duncan was about the relationships that they formed with other students, other boys that were there, and how they were like formed into little gangs and protected each other. And when one got a parcel from home with a bit of cake in it, that they had particular people that were in their gang that they would share that with. And they were always very anxious to tell me that. So they're always very anxious to tell me about the good that they had in their friends there. But then they almost invariably also told me the story about how their time in an institution broke the bonds with their family. So that was one of those things that nearly everybody said, that after they had been in the institution, they left, they went to England, they never went home. Their bond with their mother was broken, so they might have ended up in there. There was somebody as young as 8 ended up in there. 12 was supposed to be the age, the limit that they could go in. But yeah, there is this talking about how their time there separated them from their family and broke the bonds of love and connection with their parents, and they never really left them again. So yeah, it's a strange one. It's, you know, again, it's that intangible thing of what it did to people, what the experience of just being separated did to their lifelong relationships.
and often talking about their siblings who went through similar experiences, but they didn't talk about it. So they would talk, like I remember one of them said to me that she told me stuff she hadn't even talked about with her own brothers, and that they just, you know, it was kind of reassuring in a way, because I was a bit worried about how re-traumatizing it was for her, but she told me that she was really glad to have talked about it, because her and her brothers never talked about their experiences, and so she felt like she couldn't talk about it, and she wanted somebody to be able to remember it, because otherwise nobody was going to, because it wasn't being spread amongst the family, it wasn't being talked about, it was just something you keep within and you don't talk about it. And so she was just pleased that somebody was using it in some way, which I thought was kind of, again, interesting. But more, I was just like, thank goodness, because I was really worried she was having a terrible time on that side. But she was actually just pleased that somebody wanted to know her story. So
I did ask somebody, did it help to actually be there and talk about it? And again, the answer is I don't know yet. So you're always kind of taking a chance on that kind of thing. But the Children's War Museum in Sarajevo just opened fairly recently. I haven't been yet. But they've got, it'll be on the slides so you'll have it, that they do work with people putting in objects to do with their childhood trauma of war, and how therapeutic it is. So sites like these can actually be used as therapeutic sites. And that's what I mean about private spaces, a space for people to actually go and work and donate and to tell their story, and how much that helps.
Anything else?
well, emotionally traumatized.
If there's no other questions, I think we can kind of wrap it up there. I'd like to thank Brenda and Laura for a fantastic meeting. And
We love telling our war stories. And if you need to have anything clarified from the points, just drop us an email.